They said the air itself could betray us. That sound, our voices, our songs, our words, could be tracked, traced, and silenced. But even then, I remember thinking that silence was worse. My name is Claire Delaunay, and during the darkest years of France, I became a voice on forbidden airwaves. Not a soldier, not a spy, just a woman with a transmitter, a microphone, and enough defiance to risk everything for a few minutes of truth. Before the war, I had been a journalist in Lyon. I wrote about theater and music, small stories that never meant much but made people smile. When the Germans arrived, the presses were taken, the stations seized, and every word became dangerous. I remember the morning I saw the tricolor flag lowered from the town hall, replaced by that other one, the red, white, and black with the crooked cross. It felt as if the entire country had stopped breathing. From that day, our newspapers spoke only lies. The radio stations became the voice of the occupier, and yet people still gathered around their sets each night, listening in silence, searching for something real. That was how I first heard the whisper of the resistance, through the static of a forbidden frequency. It came from London, faint and crackling, a man's voice cutting through the interference. Ici Londres, les Français parlent au Français. The French speaking to the French. I leaned closer, my heart pounding. The message was short, coded, almost poetic. The night is dark, but the dawn will come. It was illegal to listen, punishable by prison or worse, but for me it felt like oxygen. I knew in that moment that I wanted to be part of that voice. A few weeks later, a friend introduced me to a man named Julien Mercier. He was quiet, almost shy, but his eyes carried a steady intensity. He asked me if I could type. I said yes. He asked if I could keep secrets. I said I could try. That night, I followed him through narrow alleys to a small apartment above a bakery. The room smelled of flour and metal, and in the corner stood something that looked like a sewing machine, except it hummed with electricity. A transmitter. "This," he said softly, "is how we speak when they try to silence us." That first night, I didn't speak on air. I only listened. The voice belonged to an older man, his words calm but firm, sending coded messages to resistance cells across the region. Train numbers, supply routes, warnings. Each word could mean life or death. When he finished, he turned to me and smiled faintly. "You have a clear voice," he said. "We could use that." I didn't answer right away, but my heart already had. Within days, I was part of the team. There were 5 of us in total. Julien the technician, René the codebreaker, Simone who handled messages from London, the old broadcaster we called the Professor, and me. Our schedule was irregular. We changed locations every few nights, carrying the transmitter in a suitcase, and the antenna coiled like a serpent under our coats. Each broadcast was an act of defiance measured in minutes. Before the German direction finders could triangulate our signal, we never spoke of fear, but it was always there. You could feel it in the air when we tuned the frequency, in the silence that followed each knock on the door. The Gestapo's vans roamed the streets at night, listening for forbidden signals. When the needle on the signal meter trembled, it wasn't just electricity. It was the pulse of our lives. My first broadcast came sooner than I expected. The professor had been arrested 2 days earlier, during a raid in Toulouse. We heard about it from a contact who barely escaped. There was no time to mourn. His absence left silence where his voice should have been. That evening, Julien looked at me across the table. "Claire," he said, "can you read?" I nodded, my throat dry. Simone handed me a sheet of paper filled with coded phrases, pre-approved by London. "Speak slowly," she whispered. "They must understand every word." When the red light flickered on, my hands trembled. The microphone was small, but it felt heavier than anything I had ever held. I took a breath and began, "Ici France libre. The night is long, but France has not fallen. To those in hiding, to those waiting, to those who still believe, we are with you." My voice quivered at first, but as I continued, something changed. I wasn't Claire the journalist anymore. I was a voice for all of us who refused to vanish. When we finished, Julian cut the transmission, unplugged the cables, and exhaled deeply. "They'll be searching for us now," he said. We packed everything in silence, every movement rehearsed. Within 10 minutes, the room was bare. We left through the back alley, just as the church bells rang midnight. Later, when we heard the sirens echoing across the district, none of us spoke. We simply walked faster. Over the next months, our broadcast became more daring. We reported German movements, read coded instructions from London, and played short messages meant to reach scattered groups of fighters in the forests. Sometimes, we even played fragments of forbidden music, Edith Piaf, Django Reinhardt, small bursts of defiance, wrapped in melody. Each time we transmitted, I wondered who might be listening. Perhaps a family huddled in a cellar, perhaps a young man hiding in the mountains. It didn't matter. What mattered was that someone, somewhere, still heard us. But our work was never without loss. One night in late 42, René failed to return from a courier run. We learned days later that he had been captured near Dijon. They found coded messages hidden in his shoe. He was executed 2 weeks later. Julian didn't speak for days after that. I tried to focus on the broadcasts, but his silence was heavier than the static. Grief had become part of our frequency. Sometimes when the nights were too quiet, I thought about what would happen if they caught us. The interrogations, the camps, the things people whispered about but never described. I told myself I was ready to die, if it came to that. But the truth is, I wasn't. None of us were. We wanted to live, to see the day when we could speak without fear, to say our names again, aloud. One evening, as we set up in an abandoned farmhouse, the generator began to sputter. The sound of it filled the room like a dying heartbeat. Julian cursed under his breath, checking the wires. The transmission window was closing. London was waiting for our confirmation. I knelt beside him, my fingers numb from cold, holding the light steady as he repaired the connection. When the signal finally returned, he looked at me and smiled. Tired, but real. "Sometimes," he said, "resistance is nothing more than keeping the signal alive." That winter was the hardest. German patrols increased, and collaborators whispered names in exchange for favors. We changed safe houses constantly, never sleeping in the same bed twice. The radio became both our weapon and our chain. Its hum followed me, even in dreams. I'd wake at night, convinced I could still hear the static. In those moments, I wondered if the air itself remembered us, if our voices, carried across the dark, left traces that could never be erased. Then came a message from London that changed everything. "Prepare for dawn." It was short, cryptic, but we all knew what it meant. Something was coming. A plan, a storm, hope. The Allies were preparing for an invasion, and we would be the echo inside occupied France. Our broadcast would spread the codes, the warnings, the call to rise when the time came. We didn't know it then, but we were transmitting the first notes of what history would later call D-Day. And though our names would never be written in the books, our voices had already carved themselves into the invisible air of France. Voices the enemy could never truly silence. The night before it all began, I remember standing by the window of our new hideout, a small attic above a shuttered bookshop in Tours. Rain tapped softly against the glass, and the radio wires hung from the rafters like veins in the ceiling. Below, the streets were empty, silent but tense, as if the city itself was holding its breath. We had received another coded message from London that morning. "The pianist will soon play." It meant only one thing. The invasion was coming. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. Julian sat at the table, disassembling and cleaning every component of the transmitter as if it were a weapon. Simone sorted the incoming notes from our couriers, her fingers trembling slightly despite her composure. We were all exhausted, half ghosts already, but the knowledge that something greater than us was finally moving, that history itself was shifting, kept us awake. In the early hours, as dawn turned the rooftops pale blue, we began the first of many broadcasts that would prepare the resistance for what was to come. The messages were short and strange to the untrained ear. Snippets of poetry, lines from songs, fragments of proverbs. But to those who knew the codes, they meant action. Bridges to sabotage, supply lines to cut, safe houses to prepare. I read each line slowly, carefully, my voice steady even as my hands shook. The crow flies at midnight. The apple will fall from the tree. Jean has lost his hat. Each phrase carried a spark that would ignite somewhere far away. In a field, a railway yard, a darkened attic like ours. Somewhere people would listen and move, risking their lives for the words I spoke. It was a strange kind of power, terrifying and humbling at once. But with every transmission, the noose tightened. The Gestapo had grown desperate. They deployed new vans, equipped with rotating antennas and detection devices that could pinpoint a signal within minutes. We knew it was only a matter of time before luck ran out. Every time I spoke, I could almost feel their direction finders sweeping through the night, like invisible predators. We began broadcasting at irregular hours, sometimes at dusk, sometimes at dawn, always changing frequencies. Julian would count the seconds under his breath while I read, his eyes locked on the needle of the signal meter. 30 seconds more, he would whisper, then we cut. That last minute always felt like eternity. The static seemed to thicken, as if the air itself were warning us to stop. Still, we continued. Not out of courage, courage was too noble a word, but out of necessity. We had already lost too much to turn back. Then came the night that everything almost ended. It was early May 1944. The orders from London were increasing, and our transmitter had been active more often than ever before. We were in a farmhouse near Blois, hidden beneath a false floor in the barn. The smell of hay mixed with the sharp tang of the generator fuel. I had just finished reading the latest coded segment when Julian suddenly stiffened. The signal meter was spiking wildly. "They're close," he said, his voice low but urgent. We killed the transmission instantly. Simone grabbed the notes and stuffed them into the stove, the paper curling into black ash. Outside, a faint hum began to rise, the sound of an engine. My heart hammered in my chest. We heard doors slam, boots crunching on gravel, voices shouting in German. "Hide the transmitter," Julian whispered. We worked without thinking. The cables were coiled, the radio body wrapped in a tarp, hidden beneath the hay. The rest of us scrambled into a crawl space under the floorboards, pressing ourselves flat against the dirt. The boards above us creaked as the soldiers entered. I could see their boots through the gaps, black, polished, precise. They searched for nearly an hour. I could hear the scrape of metal, the barked orders, the sound of furniture being overturned. Then a pause. One of them spoke quietly, another boot step, and then a cough. The hatch above us lifted. Julian reacted before I could think. He lunged upwards, slamming the hatch shut with his shoulder, shouting at us to run. I remember his voice, strained but clear. "Go, now." We crawled through the back tunnel that led to the woods, my hands clawing at the earth, the air filling with smoke and shouting. Behind us, a gunshot cracked. Then another. We didn't stop running until dawn. When we finally reached the river, there were only 3 of us. Simone, a courier named Etienne, and me. Julian was gone. We waited for hours, praying he would appear from the trees. He never did. For weeks afterward, I could still hear the sound of the hatch slamming shut. The image haunted me, the way he had turned, eyes calm even in chaos. I wanted to believe he had escaped, that he had somehow found another way out. But in my heart, I knew the truth. He had given us time, and in this war, time was life. We relocated to Paris under new names. The city was suffocating under occupation. Posters of German officers plastered every wall, curfews enforced by machine guns, ration lines stretching down the boulevards. But beneath it all, something was stirring. You could feel it in the way people met each other's eyes in the street, in the scraps of tricolor ribbon tied discreetly to fences. Hope was returning. Simone and I reconnected with another cell of broadcasters, young, reckless men, operating from a basement near Montmartre. They called themselves Voix de la Liberté, the voice of freedom. Their transmitter was small but powerful, powered by a stolen battery from a German truck. I joined them as if it were the most natural thing in the world. There was no ceremony, no oath, just a nod and a shared understanding. We would keep the signal alive. By June, the broadcasts had become relentless. The Allies were close, and London's messages filled the airwaves with coded urgency. Each time we transmitted, we knew we were speaking to thousands across occupied France. Our frequency became a heartbeat pulsing beneath the silence of fear. Then one night, the message came, the one we had been waiting for. This is London calling. The dice are on the table. It meant the invasion had begun. I can still remember the feeling in that basement. The static hissed, the air thick with anticipation. Simone covered her mouth, tears streaming silently down her face. One of the boys started laughing, quiet at first, then louder, a sound half joy, half disbelief. I pressed my hand to the microphone, trying to steady my voice. "This is the voice of free France," I said, "to those in the fields, to those in the mountains, to those who wait in the shadows, rise. The hour has come." We didn't cut the signal right away. For once, we let it run, filling the air with music, a scratchy recording of La Marseillaise, faint and distorted, but unmistakable. I closed my eyes and imagined it echoing through the occupied cities, reaching the ears of prisoners, of hidden families, of every soul who had forgotten what freedom sounded like. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of being found. The days that followed were chaos. The liberation moved like a storm across the country. German forces fled, then fought, then fled again. The city erupted in skirmishes. The sound of gunfire replaced the curfew bells. We broadcasted as long as the power held, relaying news from the front lines, reading names of fallen comrades, urging restraint and courage in equal measure. When the Allies finally entered Paris, I was still at the microphone. The signal was faint, the equipment battered, but I needed to speak one last time. "To those who are listening," I said, "we have never been silent. Through the static, through the fear, through the dark. We have always been here. France is free again." Afterward I walked outside. The air smelled of smoke and dust, but also of life. People were pouring into the streets, shouting, crying, singing. Flags appeared from hidden drawers. Strangers embraced. For a long moment, I stood in the middle of it all, unable to move. Then Simone found me and slipped her arm through mine. "They'll write about the soldiers," she said softly, "not about us." "Maybe not," I replied, "but they'll still hear us." Years later, when the war was just a memory, and the radios no longer crackled with danger, I sometimes tuned to the empty frequencies we once used. All I heard was static, but if I listened closely beneath the noise, I could almost imagine the faint echo of our voices still traveling through the air, refusing to fade. Because that's the thing about sound. It never truly disappears. When I look back, I think that the most dangerous thing we ever broadcast wasn't an order, or a coded message, or a call for resistance. It was hope. Hope made people believe again, and that was the one thing the occupiers couldn't afford to let live. After D-Day, every word we sent out carried more weight. The Germans were retreating, but in their desperation they grew even more violent. Cities that had endured 4 years of fear now braced for the chaos of their withdrawal. It was as if the entire country was holding its breath, waiting for liberation or destruction. By the summer of 1944, our network had become a ghostly pulse running beneath France. The Gestapo was collapsing entire safe houses one after another. Every day, new names disappeared. We changed frequencies so often I could barely keep track of them. The airwaves felt haunted, filled with fragments of broken voices, abrupt static, and sudden silences where someone's transmission had been cut short forever. Sometimes, when I tuned through the bands, I thought I heard echoes of those who'd been captured. Maybe it was only interference, maybe not. In that world, ghosts spoke in Morse code. We had moved south, into the crumbling remains of a vineyard outside Tours. The cellar smelled of earth and wine, a strangely comforting scent that made the nights bearable. The walls were thick enough to muffle the signal, and the hum of our generator was hidden by the sound of distant trains. I shared the space with 2 others, Etienne, a schoolteacher turned engineer, and Margot, who used to sing in cafes before the occupation silenced her stage. Now she was our code voice, clear and calm, reading the messages we sent to London. We slept in shifts, worked in shadows, and trusted no one outside that room. By then, fear wasn't something sharp anymore. It was dull, constant, woven into everything we did. I had learned to keep my fear close, not as an enemy, but as a reminder that I was still alive. Each broadcast followed a rhythm, a fragile heartbeat in the dark. I would prepare the message, Etienne would tune the frequency, and Margot would speak, her voice steady even when we knew the patrols were close. Sometimes the power would flicker, and I'd think of how easily our little world could vanish. One wrong signal, one misplaced trust, one betrayal. In those months, I began to understand the strange power of a human voice. When you speak into a microphone in secret, knowing that strangers are listening in barns, cellars, and attics across a nation under occupation, you start to feel connected to something larger than yourself. We weren't soldiers, yet our words could shift movements, guide fighters, save lives. It was intoxicating and terrifying. Every syllable mattered. We knew the Allies were coming closer. There were whispers of tanks on the horizon, of towns liberated overnight. And yet, even as the front approached, the Gestapo didn't loosen their grip. They wanted to crush the spirit before it could rise again. Whole villages were burned in retaliation for resistance broadcasts. Families were executed for owning hidden radios. The air itself felt hunted. One night, our transmission was interrupted by static so violent it shook the speakers. Etienne frowned, adjusting the dials, but the interference only grew louder. And then we heard it, a voice, smooth and accented, breaking through our own signal. This is the voice of truth, brought to you by the Reich. To all who oppose order, know that you are already dead. The message repeated, mocking us, until Margot reached out and shut the microphone off. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was heavier than fear. That night, I dreamt of voices melting into the static, of names erased by white noise. When I woke, Etienne was gone. His bedroll lay empty, his tools missing. Whether he'd been caught or had run, we never knew. Margot and I didn't speak of it. We just kept working. The war didn't pause for grief. Days blurred together. Bombs in the distance coded messages from London, news of Paris rising. When the city finally rebelled in August, we received our most important order yet. Broadcast the call to all remaining French units to converge on the capital. Paris is fighting. The hour has come. The message was short, urgent, and dangerous beyond words. Transmitting it meant exposing ourselves, but we didn't hesitate. That night, I took the microphone myself. My voice trembled at first, then steadied. This is Radio France Libre, I said. To all who still hear us, stand. The hour of liberation is near. Do not give up. Paris rises for all of us. For a few seconds after, there was only static. Then, faintly, I thought I heard applause through the feedback. It was probably just an echo, but I still like to believe that someone somewhere was listening and smiled. 2 nights later, the Germans raided our sector. Trucks and searchlights combed the fields. Margot and I fled through the vines carrying nothing but a single coil of cable and a packet of codes. The sound of barking dogs followed us as we ran. We crossed a stream, crawled under a fence, and collapsed inside an abandoned barn. For hours, we lay there, soaked and shivering, afraid to breathe. At dawn, the world felt empty. The vines were burned, our station destroyed, everything we had built gone. Margot stared at the ground, her hands trembling. I wanted to tell her we'd rebuild, that our voices couldn't be silenced, but even I didn't believe it then. War had a way of devouring everything, even courage. We spent the next weeks moving from one ruined village to another, carrying our transmitter in pieces wrapped in rags. Everywhere we went, the same signs of collapse. German convoys retreating, towns in ruins, people too weak to cheer. Liberation didn't come like a parade. It came like exhaustion, like a fever breaking after too long. When American tanks finally rolled through Tours, people cried in the streets. I should have felt joy, but all I felt was emptiness. After years of silence and fear, freedom felt almost unbearable in its noise. A few days later, I found Margot sitting outside a burned cafe staring at her hands. "It's over," she said softly, as if testing the words. I sat beside her, and for the first time, neither of us had anything to broadcast. In the months that followed, France tried to find its voice again. Everyone was searching for meaning, for lost family, for reasons why they had survived when so many hadn't. The resistance was celebrated in public, but in private, there was guilt. Those who had collaborated vanished into silence. Those who had resisted bore the weight of remembering. For me, silence was the hardest part. After years of speaking to an invisible audience, the quiet felt endless. I returned to Paris in late 1945. The city was still scarred, bridges rebuilt in wood, buildings pocked with bullet holes, ration lines winding through the streets. But radios were playing again. The air was alive with voices, American jazz, political speeches, the laughter of children who had never known the occupation. It was strange and beautiful. And yet, every time I heard static between stations, I felt my chest tighten. To most people, it was just noise. To me, it was the sound of memory. I was invited to join the new National Broadcasting Service. They wanted a voice who had experience with transmission under difficult conditions. The irony made me smile. In the studio, under the soft glow of real electric light, I spoke again. Not in secret this time, but openly, without fear. The first time I said, "This is Radio France," I almost cried. But it wasn't the same. Freedom changes the sound of your own voice. Sometimes people recognize me from rumors, the girl from the resistance broadcasts. They would ask what it felt like, how it was to speak while the Gestapo listened. I always said the same thing. It felt like shouting into the dark and hearing humanity whisper back. Margot never came to Paris. She moved south, opened a bakery, and refused to talk about the war again. I visited once years later. She gave me bread still warm from the oven and said, "We fed them words. Now I feed them life." I think that was her way of making peace. As for Etienne, his name appeared on a list of prisoners executed in 44. When I saw it, I felt the world tilt slightly, as if a part of the signal had gone silent forever. I still keep his tuning dial on my desk. It's rusted now, but when I turn it, I swear I can hear his voice adjusting the static. Now, decades later, I still speak to students, journalists, and those who think resistance is a story from long ago. They ask me how we dared to broadcast, how we kept our courage. I tell them the truth. We were afraid every second. but we had something stronger than fear, the belief that words could outlast bullets. I often replay that last transmission in my mind. Paris rises for all of us. I didn't know then how true it would be. The city rose from ashes, yes, but so did the idea that no power, no army, no tyranny can silence truth forever. The airwaves are eternal. They carry memory, laughter, and defiance in equal measure. When I walk by the Seine at dusk, I sometimes imagine the ghost of my younger self, hunched over the microphone, whispering to a nation in darkness. She still lives there, somewhere between the frequencies, sending her signal into the night. I like to think someone, somewhere, still listens and smiles. Because in the end, that's all a broadcaster ever wants. Not fame, not recognition, but to be heard, even if only by one heart in the dark. When the war ended, silence didn't come all at once. It arrived in fragments, a gunshot that never echoed, a night without curfew sirens, a sky that stayed dark without bombs. It was strange, almost unsettling. For so long the rhythm of my life had been measured by transmissions, danger, and the pulse of invisible voices. Now there was peace, but it felt like standing in a room where the music had stopped and no one knew what to say. Paris was alive again, but in a haunted way. The cafes were full, but laughter sounded cautious, as if people were still testing its meaning. Children ran through the streets chasing each other past the ruins, and their joy was something holy, fragile, luminous, impossible to ignore. Yet behind every smile was loss. Every family had an empty chair at the table. Every building carried ghosts in its walls. I moved back into a small apartment near Montparnasse, the same neighborhood where I had lived before the occupation. The first morning there, I woke to the sound of a radio playing in the next room. An old man, perhaps a neighbor, was listening to a broadcast from the new national service. My service. I sat on my bed, still wrapped in a blanket, and listened to a young announcer's voice tremble slightly as he read the news. It was a familiar tone, the blend of fear and pride that only comes from speaking truth aloud. I smiled, remembering what that felt like. But returning to normal life was harder than I had imagined. Every sound startled me. A knock on the door sent my heart racing. At night, I dreamed of the static, endless waves of white noise swallowing voices, names, whole memories. In those dreams, I was always adjusting the frequency, searching for something I could never quite find. When I told a doctor about it months later, he said it was war nerves. Perhaps it was, but to me, it felt like I'd left a part of myself inside those airwaves, and without it, I wasn't complete. The first months of liberation were filled with chaos, disguised as celebration. Collaborators were dragged from their homes, their heads shaved, paraded through the streets. The crowds cheered, hungry for justice, or maybe just revenge. I watched once from a window as a woman was pushed through the square, her hair hacked unevenly, her dress torn. The crowd called her a traitor. She had worked as a translator for the Germans. I couldn't bring myself to join in. I knew too well what fear could make people do. Survival wasn't always noble. Sometimes it was just survival. The trials came next. Men in suits sitting behind desks judging others for choices none of them had ever been forced to make. I was asked to testify once about a radio engineer who had betrayed our signal locations to the Gestapo. He'd done it for money, for food, for his family. The reasons changed with each telling. I stood in that courtroom, staring at the man who had caused the deaths of at least 3 resistance members, and waited for the hatred to rise. It didn't. I just felt tired. When the judge asked if I wanted to speak, I said only one thing. The dead don't need vengeance. They need memory. That line was quoted in a newspaper the next day. People stopped me in the street to thank me for my courage. But it wasn't courage. It was honesty. I had seen what hatred did when left to grow unchecked. I didn't want to feed it anymore. Work helped. I returned to radio, though it wasn't the same as before. Now the broadcasts were polished, official, full of optimism about reconstruction and progress. We were building a new France, one that would never again bow to tyranny. Yet beneath that bright promise, there was exhaustion. The war had burned through everyone, and no one wanted to admit how much it had taken. Sometimes, after my shifts, I stayed in the studio alone. I would turn on the microphone, lower the lights, and just listen, not broadcasting, not recording, just listening to the faint hum of the equipment, to the steady rhythm of electricity flowing through copper wires. There was something intimate in that sound. It reminded me of the nights in the cellar, when the whole world had depended on whispers in the dark. The memory was both painful and comforting. It was proof that I had lived through it. Margot wrote to me once, a short letter written in careful slanted script. She said she had opened a small bakery in Avignon, that she liked the smell of dough in the mornings, that the warmth of the ovens made her feel safe. "I still hum when I knead the bread," she wrote. "Sometimes the same tunes I used to sing into the microphone. The customers don't know, of course, but it feels like a secret I share with the air." I read that letter over and over. It was simple, but it felt like redemption. I wanted to visit her, but I never did. Perhaps I was afraid of seeing how far we had drifted from the people we once were. The war had bound us together in purpose, but peace had scattered us like ashes on the wind. That was the cruelest part of survival, discovering that the end of danger did not bring the end of loneliness. One evening in 1946, I was invited to speak at a gathering of journalists. The theme was "The Future of Truth in a Free Nation." The title made me laugh when I first read it. After years of living in secrecy, truth felt like a delicate thing, too fragile to be tamed by lectures and slogans. But I went anyway. I stood on that stage in front of hundreds of people, the lights hot against my face, and tried to explain what it meant to fight with words instead of weapons. I told them that the microphone had been my rifle, my signal, my resistance, that every broadcast was an act of faith, faith that someone somewhere would hear and believe. When I finished, the applause was long, but I barely heard it. I was thinking of Etienne, of his quiet concentration as he tuned the transmitter, of Margot humming softly while she adjusted the levels, of the nights when we thought our words might never make it past the walls, and yet we spoke anyway. The truth was, I hadn't fought for victory. I had fought for the sound of humanity still breathing through the noise. Years passed, France changed, the wounds healed on the surface, though the scars remained underneath. The children born after the war grew up in a country that spoke of resistance like legend, polished and simplified, stripped of its contradictions. I was asked to record interviews to tell my story for documentaries and archives. They wanted heroism, drama, certainty, but I couldn't give them that. Real resistance wasn't made of glory. It was made of fear, confusion, and moments of impossible choice. I told them the truth even when it wasn't cinematic. Some looked disappointed. I didn't mind. Memory isn't theater, it's survival. In the early 1950s, the government created a memorial for the radio operators who had died in the war. Their names were engraved on a wall in the courtyard of the broadcasting house. I went to the ceremony and stood among the crowd, tracing the letters with my fingers. Etienne's name was there, along with dozens of others. Margot wasn't with me, but I could almost hear her voice beside mine. When the minister finished his speech, a moment of silence followed. The wind carried a faint sound from a nearby antenna, a hum, almost like static. I closed my eyes. For a heartbeat, it felt as if the airwaves were alive again, filled with their voices. After that day, I stopped working in radio. I began writing instead. Essays, small reflections, nothing grand. Words on paper were quieter, less fleeting. They didn't vanish into the air. They stayed. I think I needed that permanence. The war had taught me that sound, beautiful as it is, can disappear too easily. Sometimes young reporters visit me, eager, bright-eyed, asking for advice. They want to know how to stay brave, how to speak truth in times of fear. I tell them there's no secret. Bravery is just persistence, the stubborn refusal to go silent. They nod, scribbling in notebooks, and I smile, wondering if they'll ever truly understand. I hope they never have to. Now in the evenings, I sit by my window overlooking the city. The world hums with radios, televisions, new machines that can send voices across oceans. Somewhere in that vast sea of sound, I like to imagine our old frequency still drifting, faint, distant, but alive. Sometimes I even turn on my little receiver and tune through the bands, listening for ghosts. Once, I thought I heard a woman's voice, soft and clear, speaking my name. It lasted only a second before dissolving into static, but for that moment, it felt like Margot was saying goodbye. I have kept the microphone from our last transmitter. It sits on my desk, tarnished but whole. Every now and then I touch it and remember what it was to speak into darkness, knowing that words were the only light we had. That's the thing about radio, about truth, really. You never see where it goes, but you trust that it reaches someone, somewhere. That's enough. The war taught me many things, but above all it taught me this. Silence is never neutral. It's a space waiting to be filled. By fear or by courage, by lies or by truth. We chose truth, even when it whispered. And that, I think, is why we won. The night the Gestapo found us, Paris was eerily quiet. Even the usual murmur of curfew patrols seemed to vanish beneath the thick, suffocating air. We had been broadcasting for almost 2 years by then. 2 years of whispers, defiance, and coded hope. And yet, in those final hours, the walls themselves seemed to listen. I remember sitting at the transmitter, fingers trembling, watching the signal light blink with the rhythm of my heartbeat. The message was short, almost too short to carry the weight it needed to bear. France lives. Do not lose faith. That was all. Those few words, repeated over and over, were the last we would ever send. Claire stood by the window, her silhouette outlined by the faint glow of a single candle. She looked calm, almost serene, as if she had made peace with something I was still struggling to accept. "They're close," she said quietly, a voice steady. I nodded. We had always known this day would come. Every message, every word spoken into the darkness was a step closer to discovery. But knowing and feeling are different things, and in that moment, I felt the raw pulse of fear in my chest, sharp and alive. The radio crackled, static bled into silence. The neigh boots on the stairs, the pounding of wood. Claire turned to me, and in her eyes I saw both terror and pride. "Finish it," she whispered. I leaned into the microphone one last time, my voice shaking. "This is la voix de la liberté. We will return." Then I cut the power. The door burst open. Shouts filled the room. The air smelled of gun oil and dust. Hands grabbed us, pulling, dragging. The candle fell, rolling across the floor, leaving a smear of wax before it died out. They separated us, Claire in one truck, me in another. The streets outside were blacked out, only the faint flicker of a cigarette in the driver's mouth visible in the rearview mirror. I tried to count the turns, to memorize the path, but the city felt endless, foreign, as if it too had turned against us. At Frayne Prison, time dissolved. Days and nights blended into a single gray fog. They questioned me for hours. Who helped us? Where the broadcast came from? Who funded us? I said nothing. They broke 2 of my fingers. My voice cracked under the pain, but my silence remained intact. In that cell, surrounded by concrete and the echo of distant screams, I realized something. The radio had never been about us. It had never been about survival. It had been about them, the listeners who needed to know they were not alone. And that truth, fragile yet unbreakable, gave me strength. Months later, when the Allies landed in Normandy, I was still alive. Barely. Word spread through whispers in the cells, passed from prisoner to prisoner, like contraband hope. "They're coming," someone said. "The Americans are coming." The guards grew more erratic, their cruelty more desperate. One night, gunfire erupted somewhere outside the prison walls. By morning, they were gone. The doors were open. We walked out into the sunlight like ghosts. Paris had been liberated. I found Claire weeks later, or rather what was left of her. She hadn't survived the camps. A nurse handed me a small, folded piece of paper recovered from her belongings. A message written in her handwriting: "They can silence us, but not the air." I read it over and over until the ink blurred from my tears. She had believed in something bigger than victory. She had believed in the endurance of truth. After the war, I returned to the ruins of our old studio. The transmitter was gone, stripped for parts, the room hollow except for a single microphone stand lying on its side. I picked it up, dusted it off, and placed it upright on the table. For a moment, I closed my eyes and imagined the hum of the old equipment, the faint echo of our voices filling the airwaves once again. France lives. Do not lose faith. The same words, unchanged, but now they carried the weight of everything we had lost. Years passed. The city healed slowly, unevenly. People forgot names, dates, even stories. But sometimes, late at night, when the radio static flickers just before a broadcast, I imagine that somewhere beneath the noise you can still hear us. Faint, distant, but alive. The rebels who spoke the truth when it was forbidden. The voices that refused to die. I live quietly now by the Seine. The world is louder, faster, more indifferent. Yet every time I pass an antenna, or hear a child's laughter echo between buildings, I feel a pulse of connection. A reminder that sound travels farther than memory. And maybe that's enough. Maybe our words, carried on invisible waves, will never stop moving. They told us we couldn't win. That words were powerless, but we proved them wrong, because every whisper, every act of defiance, every stolen transmission was a declaration. We are still here. And even if no one remembers our names, as long as there's a signal in the air, the world will know that once, in the heart of occupied France, a handful of voices chose to speak, and by doing so, they helped the world find its courage again.